Assassin's Creed Origins handed in a nice bump in visual quality on PS4 Pro over that of base hardware. Resolution was the big improvement here, with things moving up from around 1080p on base hardware up to between 1350 to 1584p. It wasn't enough to give us the impression of a native 4K image, but it provided a tangible leap over what base hardware would be doing on a 4K screen. We were getting more sharpness and detail extracted from the game's visuals, something that owners of 4K TVs would really benefit from. But outside of that, upgrades were kind of thin on the ground. Essentially, the core artwork was identical between base and pro, and in terms of improved visual effects, most of the tweaks came from the increased pixel count, meaning that things such as LOD transitions and samples used for anisotropic filtering were improved. But ultimately, the effects work and core assets remain the same. So we were wondering just how much graphical complexity was being left on the table here. What would the PC version bring? In previous Assassin's Creed titles, the PC release has brought us higher quality assets, refined effects, and of course the ability to run at higher resolutions and frame rates. And with Assassin's Creed Origins, it's clear that moving to PC does give you a nice upgrade over PS4 Pro, but perhaps it's not quite the quantum leap we expect in every area. To kick things off, in order to get the game running looking at its best, we had to kind of make a choice between resolution and frame rate. With the GTX 1080 Ti, we weren't able to hit 4K 60 running at max settings, so we chose to cap at 30 frames per second. This allows us to maximize graphical quality while keeping frame rates relatively smooth. And of course, this opens up the possibility of running at native 4K, by far the biggest upgrade you'll find on PC. In fact, the resolution boost is something that stands out the most. With true 4K and no scaling artifacts, we can really appreciate the quality of the artwork on show. As you'd expect, more detail is fleshed out, but what really impresses us here is the clarity. The extra pixel count really adds more definition to distant scenery, as the amount of subpixel resolve is greatly increased here. And obviously the boost in resolution has a knock-on effect with all graphical features dependent on pixel count. So for example, anisotropic filtering is given more samples, thus allowing for clearer details on oblique angles, such as the surface of the ground. And likewise, the lower bounds of the level of detail transitions are pushed out further afield. So again, we get more detail in the distance too. Pretty much exactly what you'd expect from a native 4K image, and it's a nice upgrade. The core artwork also benefits from the increased pixel count, with increased detail being fleshed out across character clothing and some of the environment. However, that said, it's a bit disappointing to see that we're not looking at higher quality textures across most of the game. The core assets are basically the same as on PlayStation 4 and indeed Xbox One. So perhaps the game isn't making the most of the full 4K resolution available, although the artwork still holds up really nicely at extreme pixel counts. That said, we do notice some refinements in terms of terrain complexity and detail. It's quite subtle, but you can notice things like slight extra foliage in the distance, along with elements such as bags featuring more geometry, giving them a smoother appearance. And on top of that, draw distance is also pushed a bit further out. Subtle details such as clothing lines, flags, all of that stuff is visible for further out, whereas on consoles it's culled a little closer to the camera. Shadow quality is also massively improved. In fact, aside from the resolution, this is probably the biggest jump we see. And there are two things going on here. The first is the jump to the highest quality preset means that shadow cascades are pushed further out, so transitions between different quality levels of shadows are less noticeable than on console, meaning we get sharper or clearer looking shadows further into the distance. Shadow resolution is also increased too, so these elements have a smoother, more refined appearance. They're not always absolutely sharper, but it means we get more definition to these elements, whether we're looking at close-ups or epic pans across the environment, where we can see intricate details for miles around. Ultimately, I would say that the PC version provides more of a refinement to consoles if we're looking at the core level of visual effects used, but I do think that the increased draw distance and shadow quality does help to provide a more detailed presentation all round. By far the biggest upgrade though, of course, is the resolution, and playing at 4K really shows off the sheer level of detail Ubisoft Montreal have crafted in this latest Assassin's Creed title. While the level of complexity may not be quite as high as Unity in all areas, there's a sense that the detailed environments, beautiful use of volumetrics, global illumination lighting, shadowing, and the material systems all provide a tangible realism to the world that not all games manage to nail, but Assassin's Creed seems to get it right most of the time, and Origins looks superb as a result. Of course, if you're playing on the PC, you don't necessarily have to target ultra high-end visuals. If you've got a full HD screen, then you might want to target 1080p at 60 frames per second instead, thus using GPU power to give you a higher frame rate while running at max settings. Alternatively, you could dial back settings closer to console levels while attempting to achieve 4K 60. But you're going to need something like a GTX 1080 Ti in order to get anywhere close to 60 frames per second at UHD resolution. Alternatively, you can cap at 30 FPS, but performance here isn't always that great. Essentially, the in-game 30 FPS cap results in stutters, basically uneven frame pacing. And if you choose the 30Hz monitor refresh, while the frame pacing is eliminated, we get weird bouts of heavy frame rate drops, which are kinda unavoidable here. So playing at 30Hz isn't optimal at this point, but if you use something like the Nvidia control panel, you can get a slightly smoother experience at the expense for some tearing when using the half rate adaptive option. Anyway, as to be expected, the PC version does deliver the best visual experience around in terms of raw graphical quality, though in terms of performance there's a bit more management required. If you can't hit 60 frames per second, then establishing a smooth 30 is a bit more difficult. Even so, I did find the experience to be generally smoother than on consoles, whether that be at 4K or 1080p. The only downside is the 30 FPS cap not working correctly without introducing unwanted stutter, which is something I think needs to be fixed in order to provide more optimization for users that can't hit 60 frames per second or higher frame rates in general. Anyway, that's PC versus Pro, but before we wrap up, let's take a quick look at base PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. PlayStation 4 gets the resolution advantage, operating usually at around 1080p, although this can drop a touch below. Whereas on Xbox One, dynamic resolution is handled a bit more aggressively. We're getting anywhere between 792, 864 and 900p, depending on how demanding individual scenes are. For the most part, the game kind of runs below 900p, resulting in a visibly softer presentation than PS4. In that sense, it's a bit of a downgrade over Assassin's Creed Unity and Syndicate here. Although I will say that the temporal anti-aliasing ensures that scaling artifacts aren't that prominent, and instead we're just looking at a softer image all round. Aside from that, there's little to tell the two apart in visual quality. Performance-wise though, PS4 does come up ahead. Xbox One tends to be 2-3 FPS behind, and also performance tends to drop a little more often. So we get the feeling that the game is a little less stable on Xbox One, with more stutter and judder impacting upon the experience from time to time. In that respect, PS4 definitely has the advantage, particularly in areas where frame rates aren't hit very hard at all. As for the cutscenes, well, it's pretty much a write-off on both systems. Xbox One falls behind again, but let's face it, when you're dropping into the mid to low 20s, it's not a great experience regardless of which console you choose to play on. Anyway, in terms of the base hardware, if you're looking for the best experience between PS4 and Xbox One, then PlayStation 4 is the way to go. Anyway, with that said, I'll leave it there. As ever, don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.